The Galactic Council chamber looked like someone had crossed a Roman amphitheater with a spaceship and then let a committee of bureaucrats loose on the interior design. Commander Riley Knox stood at the center of it all, surrounded by enough alien delegates to start their own zoo, each one more convinced of their superiority than the last. "The human species," announced Counselor Vexthera, his tentacles writhing with barely contained disgust, "must surrender their primitive warriors to galactic authority. Your kind's propensity for violence threatens the peace we have maintained for millennia." Riley adjusted her uniform and gave the assembled aliens her best customer service smile. After 20 years as a drill sergeant, she had perfected the art of looking pleasant while mentally calculating how many ways she could end someone with a paperclip. "Primitive warriors?" she asked, tilting her head like a confused golden retriever. "I'm sorry. Are we talking about the same species here? Because last I checked, we're the ones who figured out how to turn music into a weapon during the Great Silence War." A chorus of chittering, growling, and what sounded suspiciously like interstellar tutting filled the chamber. Ambassador Krell Knox, a 7-foot-tall crystalline being who looked like someone had taught a chandelier to walk, stepped forward. "Your mockery only proves our point, human. Observe the pinnacle of galactic military evolution." He gestured grandly toward a group of warriors that had just entered the chamber. Riley had to admit, the Zephyrian shock troops were impressive. Each one stood 8 feet tall, covered in what appeared to be natural armor plating, with arms that could probably bench press a small planet. They moved in perfect synchronization, their faces hidden behind masks that made them look like the universe's angriest ice hockey team. War Prime Thokike, their leader, stepped forward and let out a roar that probably registered on seismic monitors 3 star systems away. "Behold the might of Zephyr Prime. Our warriors have conquered 17 worlds without a single defeat." Riley nodded thoughtfully, then pulled out her tablet and started scrolling through what looked suspiciously like a class roster. "Oh, you mean my Tuesday morning yoga class?" The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop in a vacuum. "Your what?" Thuke's voice cracked slightly, which was impressive considering it usually sounded like grinding metal. "Well, technically it's Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday morning yoga, but who's counting?" Riley looked up from her tablet with a kind of innocent expression that had struck fear into the hearts of countless recruits. "I mean, if we're talking about primitive warriors, I assume you're referring to my former students? Because honestly, calling them warriors is being generous. Most of them can barely tie their boots without detailed instructions." Counselor Vexthera's tentacles had stopped writhing and were now pointing straight up, which Riley had learned was the alien equivalent of a human's jaw dropping. "You trained warriors?" "Trained is a strong word," Riley replied, tucking her tablet away. "I prefer help them discover their inner potential for creative problem solving. Though I'll admit, some of them got a little too creative. We had to ban Jimmy from using kitchen utensils during field exercises after the Great Sufal incident of 2387. The aliens exchanged glances that clearly said, "What the hell is a Sufal, and why should we be afraid of it?" War Prime Thoke recovered first, puffing out his already impressive chest. "Enough of this mockery. The Zephyrian Empire demands satisfaction for these insults." Riley raised an eyebrow. "Satisfaction? What are you? A 19th century gentleman? Do you want to duel at dawn too?" "If satisfaction is what you seek," Thoka continued, apparently immune to sarcasm, "then I, War Prime Thoka of the Zephyrian Shock Corps, formally challenge the human military to combat. Single engagement, winner takes all." The council chamber erupted in what Riley could only describe as alien pandemonium. Tentacles waved, crystals chimed ominously. And somewhere in the back, a delegate who looked like a sentient mushroom was making sounds that suggested either excitement or severe digestive distress. Ambassador Harrison, Earth's official diplomatic representative, and the kind of man who broke out in hives at the thought of conflict, leaped to his feet. Commander Knox cannot possibly accept such a challenge. The diplomatic ramifications alone. "Oh, I accept," Riley interrupted, raising her hand like she was volunteering to clean the chalkboard. The mushroom delegate definitely had digestive issues now. "Commander, you can't be serious," Harrison hissed, grabbing her arm. "These are elite galactic warriors. They've conquered worlds." Riley patted his hand gently. Harrison, sweetie, have you ever seen what happens when you give a human a problem and tell them they can't solve it? Well, no, but trust me on this one. Hold my coffee and watch this. She handed him her thermal mug, which read World's Okayest Drill Sergeant in faded letters. Turning back to Thoke, she clasped her hands behind her back in the parade rest position that had haunted the dreams of thousands of recruits. I accept your challenge on behalf of humanity. When and where? 3 standard days hence, aboard Neutral Station Omega, Thoke declared, clearly expecting her to back down. Combat to incapacitation or surrender. No weapons save those carried by the warrior's body in basic gear. Sounds perfect. How many per side? 5 of my finest against 5 of your yoga students. Riley's smile could have powered a small space station. Deal. Though I should warn you, my students have been known to get a little enthusiastic during group activities. As the council session devolved into chaos, Riley was already scrolling through her contacts. She had some calls to make. The first was to Marcus Rodriguez, currently managing supply chains for a terraforming company, Europa. Tank, it's Riley. Remember that time you asked if you'd ever get to use your training in the real world? Well, funny story. The second was to Priya Patel, senior accountant at Galactic Mining Consortium, and the woman who had once made an entire enemy battalion surrender by auditing their expense reports in real time. Ghost, pack your calculator. We're going to war. The third was to Jimmy O'Sullivan, pastry chef extraordinaire, and the only person Riley knew who could make explosives out of baking ingredients. Boom. How would you like to cater a very special event? Bring your whisk. Back in the council chamber, War Prime Thoke was already celebrating his impending victory with his fellow warriors. They performed what appeared to be some kind of war dance, complete with chest beating and victory roars. Riley watched them with the expression of someone observing a particularly entertaining nature documentary. She remembered her first encounter with supposedly elite forces during the Centauri conflict. They had also been very confident, very loud, and very surprised when they discovered that human military doctrine could be summarized as be polite, be professional, but have a plan to kill everybody you meet. Commander, Ambassador Harrison whispered desperately, these beings have been bred for war since before humans discovered fire. Their bones are harder than titanium, their reflexes are enhanced, and they've been trained from birth to be perfect killing machines. Riley nodded thoughtfully. Harrison, let me ask you something. Have you ever tried to teach a group of hungover college kids how to march in formation while it's raining at 5 in the morning? No, why would I? Because if you had, you'd understand that there's no force in the universe more terrifying than a human who's been properly motivated. She watched as Thuck's warriors continued their display. These guys are impressive, I'll give them that. But they're making one critical mistake. Which is? Riley's grin was absolutely predatory. They think this is about warriors. Neutral Station Omega looked like someone had built a shopping mall in space and then forgotten to stock it with anything useful. Riley stood in the main docking bay, watching as her dream team disembarked from their transport ship with all the coordination of a family arriving late for vacation. Marcus Tank Rodriguez emerged first, looking exactly like what he was, a middle-aged logistics coordinator who happened to be built like a small mountain. He was carrying what appeared to be a standard military duffel bag, though Riley knew it contained enough improvised equipment to outfit a small army. Riley. Tank's voice boomed across the docking bay as he swept her into a bear hug that could have cracked ribs. This takes me back. Remember that time on Kepler 442 when you made us build shelter using nothing but protein bars and dental floss? And you built a 3-story command center, Riley replied fondly. The engineers are still trying to figure out how that was structurally possible. Next came Priya Ghost Patel, walking with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how much everything cost and who was going to pay for it. She looked like a perfectly ordinary accountant, which was exactly what made her so dangerous. Commander Priya nodded professionally, then allowed herself a small smile. I've reviewed the Zephyrian military budget for the past 5 years. They spend 60% of their resources on intimidation tactics and ceremony. Their actual combat effectiveness is down 37% from last quarter. Of course you did, Riley laughed. And? They're overextended, undermotivated, and their supply chain has more holes than Swiss cheese. Also, their war prime has been embezzling funds to buy luxury accommodations. I have the receipts. Finally, Jimmy Boom O'Sullivan bounded off the transport with the enthusiasm of a golden retriever who had just discovered tennis balls. He was wheeling a case that was either full of pastry supplies or enough explosives to redecorate a small moon. Knowing Jimmy, it was probably both. "Riley, you beautiful, terrifying woman." Jimmy grabbed her in a hug that smelled like vanilla and something that might have been plastic. "I brought cookies." "Well, I brought the ingredients for cookies. Whether they end up as cookies or improvised munitions depends entirely on how this goes." "Please tell me you didn't pack your special frosting," Riley said, though her tone suggested she very much hoped he had. "The one that can melt through 6 inches of reinforced steel?" "Of course not." Jimmy's grin was absolutely angelic. "I brought the new recipe. It's much more efficient." As they made their way through the station, other beings gave them a wide berth. Not because they looked particularly threatening, they looked like exactly what they were: a supply manager, an accountant, and a pastry chef. But something in their casual confidence, the way they moved like they owned whatever space they occupied, set off every survival instinct in the galaxy. "So," Tank asked, hefting his duffel bag, "what's the play here, Coach?" Riley stopped at an observation window overlooking the combat arena, a sterile white chamber about the size of a football field. "Same as always, Tank. We assess, adapt, and improvise. The Zephyrians are expecting warriors, so that's the last thing we're going to give them." "What are we giving them?" Priya asked, pulling out her tablet to take notes. "A learning experience," Riley replied. "They want to see what happens when you corner humans? We're going to show them what happens when you give humans a problem, a deadline, and permission to get creative." Down in the arena, the Zephyrian warriors were running through their combat drills. They moved like a precision instrument, each motion calculated and perfect. It was actually quite beautiful, in the same way that a well-oiled machine was beautiful. Jimmy watched them thoughtfully, his head tilted like he was studying a particularly challenging recipe. "They're very synchronized." "Synchronized is predictable," Priya observed, making notes. "Predictable is exploitable. And exploitable," Tank added with a grin, "is fun." Riley smiled as she watched her former students analyze the opposition with the same methodical approach she had drilled into them years ago. The Zephyrians were about to learn something that humans had known for millennia. The most dangerous person in any fight wasn't necessarily the strongest or the fastest. It was the one who refused to play by the rules everyone else thought were fixed. "All right, people," Riley said, turning away from the window. "Let's go show them what a Tuesday morning yoga class can really do." The combat arena filled with spectators from across the galaxy, all eager to witness what they assumed would be the swift destruction of human military arrogance. Riley stood with her team at one end of the sterile white chamber, while War Prime Thoke and his warriors took their position at the other. The Zephyrians had used their preparation time to perform an elaborate pre-battle ritual that involved a lot of roaring, chest beating, and what appeared to be synchronized intimidation dancing. It was quite impressive, in the same way that a thunderstorm was impressive, loud, flashy, and ultimately just weather. Riley's team, meanwhile, had spent their time doing stretches and discussing weekend plans. "So after we're done here, I'm thinking barbecue at my place," Tank was saying, casually touching his toes. "My wife just perfected this new marinade recipe." "Sounds lovely," Priya replied, reviewing something on her tablet. "I should be free by Sunday. I just need to finish destroying the Centauri tax haven first." "Ooh, can I bring dessert?" Jimmy asked, juggling what looked suspiciously like grenades but were probably just stress balls. "Probably. I've been working on this new expansive souffle technique." The arena announcer, a being that resembled a crystalline tree with excellent diction, began the formal introductions. "Beings of the galaxy, witness this historic combat between the elite Zephyrian shock corps and the humans." The pause before humans suggested the announcer wasn't quite sure what to make of them either. War Prime Thoke stepped forward, his armor gleaming under the arena lights. "Humans, prepare to face the fury of Zephyr Prime. We who have conquered worlds, who know no fear, who..." "Excuse me," Jimmy interrupted politely, raising his hand like he was in school. "Are you going to do this whole speech thing before we start? Because I've got dough rising back on the ship and timing is really important with yeast." The absolute silence that followed was broken only by Tank's poorly suppressed snicker. Thok's mask couldn't hide his confusion. What is yeast?" "It's a fungus that makes bread fluffy," Priya explained helpfully. "Also, it can be weaponized under the right circumstances, but Jimmy probably isn't thinking about that." "I am now," Jimmy said brightly. The combat began with Thok's warriors charging forward in perfect formation, their synchronized movements a thing of lethal beauty. They had clearly trained for this exact moment their entire lives. Riley's team scattered like startled civilians, which, technically, they were. What happened next would be studied in military academies for generations, though mostly as an example of what happens when you assume your enemy will fight fair. Tank didn't engage the charging warriors head-on. Instead, he did something that confused everyone present. He started setting up what appeared to be a supply depot in the corner of the arena, but using equipment he had somehow smuggled in despite extensive security screening. Priya pulled out her tablet and began rapidly typing, apparently conducting business in the middle of a life-or-death combat situation. Within moments, the arena's environmental systems began fluctuating as she somehow gained access to the station's financial networks. Jimmy, meanwhile, had produced a portable mixing bowl and was actually making something that looked suspiciously like cookie dough, while dodging 8-foot-tall alien warriors. "This isn't how combat works," one of the Zephyrian warriors shouted, clearly frustrated as he tried to corner Tank, but who kept disappearing behind strategically placed supply crates that definitely hadn't been there a moment ago. "You're absolutely right," Riley called out, calmly walking through the chaos like she was inspecting a training exercise. "This is how humans work." The tide turned when Priya looked up from her tablet and announced, "Oh, by the way, I've just frozen all Zephyrian military accounts pending an audit investigation." "Something about unauthorized use of public funds for private luxury accommodations?" War Prime Thoke stumbled mid-charge. "You cannot do that." "Those accounts are classified." "Were classified," Priya corrected. "I've reclassified them as evidence in an ongoing investigation. Your pension fund is also under review." While Thoke was processing this information, Jimmy finished whatever he had been cooking and began distributing what looked like perfectly innocent cookies to everyone present, including the Zephyrian warriors. "Try one," he said cheerfully to a confused alien warrior. "They're a new recipe." The warrior, trained from birth to suspect poison, hesitated. "Oh, they're not poisoned," Jimmy assured him. "That would be unsporting. They're just enhanced." 3 minutes later, the first warrior who had eaten a cookie began glowing softly and speaking in what sounded suspiciously like poetry about the interconnectedness of all living beings. Jimmy, Riley called out, "What exactly did you put in those cookies?" "Just some vanilla extract, sugar, flour, and a mild euphoric compound I developed for treating combat stress," Jimmy replied, offering another cookie to an increasingly confused Zephyrian. "It's completely harmless. They'll just be very relaxed and philosophical for the next few hours." By this point, Tank had somehow constructed what appeared to be a fully functional command center in the corner of the arena, complete with communications equipment and what might have been a small cafe. "Coffee, anyone?" he called out. "I've got fresh brew going." What followed could only be described as the galaxy's most polite demolition of a supposedly elite military force. Riley watched with the satisfaction of a teacher whose students were finally putting their lessons to practical use. The Zephyrian warriors, bred for traditional combat and raised on tales of glorious battle, found themselves completely unprepared for an enemy that treated the entire engagement like a particularly challenging team-building exercise. Tank had somehow turned his corner of the arena into a logistics hub that was actively improving the station's supply efficiency. 2 of the Zephyrian warriors had wandered over to ask questions about his inventory management system, and were now taking notes. "You see, the key is predictive analytics," Tank was explaining, gesturing at a holographic display that definitely hadn't been part of the arena's original equipment. "If you can anticipate needs before they become critical, you eliminate 90% of your operational stress." Meanwhile, Priya had not only frozen the Zephyrian military accounts but had somehow gained access to their entire governmental financial system. She was now providing real-time economic analysis to anyone who asked. Your military spending has increased 400% over the last decade, but your actual combat effectiveness metrics show a net decline. She informed a warrior who had given up trying to fight and was now genuinely curious about his empire's fiscal health. Have you considered reallocating resources from ceremonial armor to actual training programs? The warrior, whose name was apparently Grok Thar, nodded thoughtfully. We have noticed that our intimidation protocols require increasingly elaborate displays to maintain effectiveness. That's because you're experiencing diminishing returns on spectacle investment, Priya explained, pulling up a chart. I could design a cost-benefit analysis for your leadership if you're interested. Jimmy, meanwhile, had established what could only be described as a field bakery and was single-handedly conducting psychological warfare through the medium of comfort food. The cookies had been just the beginning. Or prime thokai. He called out cheerfully. I made you a stress relief muffin. It's got lavender and chamomile. Very soothing for the nervous system. Thokai, who was watching his elite warriors being systematically converted into students, customers, and therapy patients, was beginning to develop what humans would recognize as a stress headache. This is not combat, he roared, though with significantly less conviction than before. This is problem-solving, Riley said, appearing beside him with the casual confidence of someone who had spent decades teaching people to think outside the box. Your warriors are excellent at following orders and executing predetermined tactics. But what happens when the predetermined tactics don't work? As if to illustrate her point, the last Zephyrian warrior still attempting traditional combat found himself tangled in what appeared to be a net made of supply chain optimization flowcharts that Tank had somehow weaponized. The warrior called out to Thokai, sounding slightly panicked. They're not fighting fair. Define fair, Riley replied conversationally. You challenged us to combat with whatever we could carry and whatever skills we possessed. My people are using exactly those things. But this isn't. Thokai gestured helplessly at the scene around him. Tank was now running what appeared to be a small business expo. Priya had somehow organized an impromptu financial literacy seminar. Jimmy was conducting cooking classes while simultaneously explaining the therapeutic benefits of baking. This isn't what? Riley asked. Effective? Because I'm looking at 5 of your elite warriors who are no longer attempting to fight and are instead learning valuable life skills. I'd call that a decisive victory. The final blow came when Jimmy approached the last standing warrior, the one tangled in Tank's flowcharts, with a warm smile and a sandwich. You look hungry, Jimmy said kindly. Ham and cheese, okay? I made the bread myself. The secret is letting the dough rest properly. You can't rush good bread, you know. The warrior stared at the sandwich, then at Jimmy's genuinely caring expression, then at his war prime, who was currently having what appeared to be an existential crisis, while Priya explained compound interest. The warrior began, then looked around at his fellow soldiers who were now engaged in animated discussions about supply chain management, fiscal responsibility, and the proper technique for achieving optimal cookie texture. He took the sandwich. I surrender, he said quietly. Then louder, I surrender to the pastry chef. The arena fell silent except for the gentle hum of Tank's inexplicably functional coffee machine. Riley turned to War Prime Thokai with the expression of someone who had just finished a satisfying day's work. So, about that unconditional surrender. The Galactic Council chamber was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop in the vacuum of space. The same beings who had been so confident in their superiority 3 days ago now stared at Riley with expressions ranging from bewilderment to what might charitably be called respectful terror. War Prime Thokai sat in what could only be described as a therapeutic position, holding a cup of Tank's coffee and looking like someone who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about the universe was wrong. His warriors were scattered around the chamber, some still taking notes from Priya's impromptu financial planning workshop, others quietly enjoying Jimmy's stress relief pastries. Let me see if I understand this correctly, Counselor Vexthara said slowly, his tentacles moving in what Riley had learned was the alien equivalent of a nervous fidget. Your forces achieved total victory without technically engaging in combat? Riley shrugged, the gesture somehow managing to convey both modesty and the subtle threat of someone who could probably conquer a small moon if she put her mind to it. I wouldn't say without combat. Tank had to physically restrain 3 different warriors who were trying to reorganize his supply depot according to their own system. Very vigorous restraining. I was gentle, Tank added, carefully bandaging a small cut on Grokthar's arm, where he had apparently scraped himself on a clipboard. But you can't just reorganize someone else's inventory without proper documentation. That's chaos. Ambassador Harrison, who had spent the entire combat trial stress eating his way through what appeared to be a family-sized container of antacids, finally found his voice. Commander Knox, what you've done here is effective? Riley suggested helpfully. Terrifying, Harrison finished. Do you realize what this means? The implications for galactic diplomacy alone. Riley began casually cleaning her fingernails with what looked suspiciously like a tactical knife. Harrison, let me explain something about human diplomacy. We prefer to talk things out, find mutually beneficial solutions, maybe share a meal and some stories. We're very reasonable people. She paused, allowing her gaze to sweep across the assembled alien delegates. But if you insist on measuring military capability, if you absolutely must know what humans are capable of when we stop being reasonable, Riley gestured toward her team, who were still in the process of providing impromptu life coaching to the Zephyrian warriors. Well, these aren't even my warriors. What do you mean? War Prime Thoka asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Riley reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a small patch, the kind worn by military instructors. It showed a simple design, cross-training tools over the words basic training, Paris Island, instructor. These are my students, she said simply. The people I taught basic skills to before they went on to learn how to actually fight. The silence that followed was so profound that several species universal translators actually shut down from lack of input to process. Your students? Counselor Vexthara's voice cracked slightly. Basic training graduates, Riley confirmed. Tank here went on to specialize in logistics. Priya focused on intelligence and financial warfare. Jimmy discovered he had a talent for both explosive ordnance disposal and morale enhancement through baked goods. Good students, all of them, but like I said, they're not warriors. She tucked the patch away and smiled the kind of smile that had made generals reconsider their battle plans. My actual warriors are back on Earth. Most of them are retired now, running libraries, teaching kindergarten, managing farms. Sergeant Major Rodriguez, that's Tank's older sister, currently runs a daycare center in Phoenix. Never met a toddler she couldn't organize or a parent she couldn't intimidate into proper pickup procedures. Ambassador Krell Knox, the crystalline being who had started this entire mess, made a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. Your kindergarten teachers are warriors? Former warriors, Riley corrected. Though honestly, the skill sets overlap more than you might think. Both jobs require infinite patience, the ability to impose order on chaos, and a willingness to do whatever it takes to protect the people under your care. She stood and brushed an invisible speck of dust from her uniform. The thing is, counselors, you made a fundamental error in your assessment of humanity. You assumed that because we're relatively new to the galactic stage, we must be primitive. You assumed that because we haven't conquered worlds, we must be weak. You assumed that because we prefer cooperation to domination, we must be helpless. Riley walked over to where Jimmy was showing a fascinated Zephyrian warrior how to properly fold cookie dough. But here's what you missed: humans don't create warriors. We create people who are capable of becoming warriors when necessary, and equally capable of becoming teachers, healers, builders, or artists when that's what's needed. Every human is potentially dangerous not because we're naturally violent, but because we're naturally adaptable. She turned back to face the council, and every being in the chamber suddenly understood why her students had turned out the way they had. So when you ask us to surrender our warriors, you're really asking us to surrender our capacity for creative problem-solving under pressure. You're asking us to give up the thing that makes us most human, our refusal to accept that any problem is unsolvable. Riley walked back to her place at the center of the chamber, her footsteps echoing in the absolute silence. The answer, in case it wasn't clear, is no. War Prime Thoke slowly stood up, setting down his coffee cup with the care of someone handling a priceless artifact. Commander Knox, My empire would like to formally apologize for this misunderstanding. We clearly did not comprehend the nature of human capabilities. No harm done, Riley replied cheerfully. Though I should mention that your warriors are welcome to visit Earth any time. Tank's wife really does make excellent barbecue, and I think some cross-cultural exchange might be good for everyone. As the council session officially ended, and the various delegates began filing out, many of them still casting nervous glances at Riley's team, Ambassador Harrison approached her with the expression of someone who had just watched his entire worldview get reorganized by a supply specialist. Commander, what happens now? Riley updated something on her tablet, then looked up with a satisfied expression of someone finishing a job well done. Now we go home, Harrison. I've got a new group of recruits starting Monday, and Tank promised to help me redesign the obstacle course. Apparently, the current one doesn't properly emphasize logistical thinking. She headed toward the exit, then paused and turned back to address the few remaining delegates. Oh, and counselors? Next time you want to test human military capabilities, maybe just ask nicely. We're usually happy to demonstrate our problem-solving skills. It's much more efficient than formal combat challenges, and Jimmy makes excellent coffee to go with the presentation. As they left the chamber, Tank could be heard asking Priya about the tax implications of interstellar gift-giving, while Jimmy was explaining to anyone who would listen that the secret to good bread was patience, proper temperature control, and just the right amount of controlled violence during the kneading process. Behind them, the Galactic Council sat in stunned silence, finally beginning to understand that they had just encountered something far more dangerous than warriors. They had encountered humans who had been properly educated. And somewhere in the back of the chamber, Grokthar was carefully writing down Jimmy's cookie recipe, while making a mental note to recommend that his empire invest heavily in better diplomatic protocols. Because apparently when humans said they preferred to talk things out, they meant it. But they were also really good at making sure those conversations went exactly the way they wanted them to go.